Hi, welcome to the Funding Blueprint Unlocking Startup Success presented by StartHub. I'm Cody Goff, and today you're going to learn how to think through a product launch. What do you need to focus on so you know you're building something people actually want, and how do you figure out who wants it? Plus, my guest today will explain what makes it really hard to fund entrepreneurs in certain parts of the world and how she's been able to overcome those challenges to invest in some of the least investor-friendly countries in the world. My guest is Megan Patel. She advises startups and companies looking to enter new markets, defines their target customer, rapidly tests concepts, innovates throughout their organization. She has experience guiding early-phase startups, launching new products, and designing customer experiences for Fortune 500 companies. Prior to her current work, Megan was the director of innovation at Chicago Beyond, a private impact investor where she built their investment pipeline by developing and launching unique ideas, approaches, and concepts. Megan is based in New York, and before our conversation, I was chatting with Megan, and I could tell she was super excited about some different types of startup innovation. So I asked if she considers herself particularly passionate about innovation, and she gave me a really interesting answer. Here's what she told me.
Yes. I think actually most people kind of have what I would call like a core human need. And mine is adventure. And I realized that once I kind of figured out that adventure was that like core human need, I've started to seek out all the different ways where I could find adventure in my life, whether that's exploring new products or traveling to different countries and meeting new people, or even in your day job, like how can you make life more adventuresome? Other people have different core human needs. And I found that a lot of the entrepreneurs that I work with, their core human need is discovery or progress, or it's pushing something forward. And I found that my need of like adventure and that excitement was a really good match in helping them get and achieve discovery all the way to then launching a product or a concept.
Yeah, in the entrepreneur world, I feel like there's a very thin line between adventure and like sheer terror,
Yeah.
right? How do you find the balance, and how do you help the people you work with find the balance so that they are a little more on the adventure side?
I think normally I help bring the adventure side so that they can calm down. No, there's so many elements to the question you just asked. A lot of it I would honestly say is like when you are a founder, it is so important to find grounding spaces. And that can be who are the people that you can call when things are actually crazy hitting the wall? Who are the people that you trust and you've almost built your own personal advisor network? And then what are the things you actually do to take care of yourself? And I think the entrepreneurs that can figure that out and kind of build that support network around them are ones that are able to withstand the moments where you think your company is going to collapse or where you don't actually know how you're going to make the next payroll.
So you've found at least a correlation between the founders with a really great network and a lot of support and how successful they are?
I think it's one element, but it's not, I think, the all elements. Something that actually, a problem that I've saw and have started to work on is I do think that talent is equally distributed, but funding is not. And more recently, I had a hypothesis that the reason that is, and the reason that like a lot of very, very great ideas don't get funding is that one, they don't know the right people. They're not in the right networks, which does go back to that. The second is that venture capitalists and other funders generally have a limited amount of time. So if they're going to pick and choose who they're going to fund, it's going to be the people that get referred to them. And lastly, I think another reason that a lot of great concepts don't get funded is the people who have the money aren't necessarily the ones experiencing the problem that entrepreneur is trying to solve, or they aren't close to it or don't have connections to it. And so something we've started to think about or have started to look at is how could you actually make this a more equitable process? So we looked at having entrepreneurs actually evaluate each other as opposed to VCs evaluating each entrepreneur. And we ended up having an entire control group of VCs that also evaluated entrepreneurs. And what we found is that when entrepreneurs actually evaluate each other, not necessarily their idea, but it's things more like their analytical capabilities, how they thought through the problem. Entrepreneurs tend to, one, be less bias towards any particular race or ethnic group. They also tend to be less biased about where you are located globally. And they're also less biased when it comes to how much capital do you already have. But the interesting thing was that we still found like a really high correlation between the entrepreneurs that VCs liked and the entrepreneurs that the other entrepreneurs, their peers, actually appreciated as well. And so I think there could be a new model or method where we start to source entrepreneurs around the world, where we actually leverage each entrepreneur evaluating each other as a way to make this a much more scalable process that is a lot less biased.
So reducing the bias comes from having the entrepreneurs evaluate each other versus the VCs exclusively and the people who are doing the funding.
Yes.
Okay. That's really interesting because, like, a lot of people don't want to be evaluated, right? So how do you facilitate a process in which entrepreneurs are evaluating each other, in which, how do you create a situation in which they're receptive to that kind of feedback?
First, the entrepreneurs have to agree to do this. And they're both being evaluated, but they're also evaluating other people. And actually, something we found that was interesting is that as entrepreneurs have to evaluate others, they actually get better themselves. Because as you're focusing on, okay, do I understand this person's problem? You start to think and reflect, like, how am I explaining my own problem? Once you get to my customer and you're talking about your customer profile and you're reading other people's and you're evaluating how analytical were they? Did they really think through all the decisions that were going on here? What was the framework they used in their discussions? They then do it for themselves. So it is true. It definitely takes a specific type of entrepreneur that's willing to kind of go forward in this process where you're getting very direct and a lot of feedback and being willing to give it. But I think ones that are open to that, especially from many different backgrounds, can have a lot of success.
Yeah, there's a lot of research showing that one of the best ways to learn is to teach. I think it is called the protege effect, but I don't remember offhand. But no, I used to host a science podcast for Discovery, and we talked about it several times. So that totally tracks with that. I want to go back to something you said. You said talent is evenly distributed, but funding is not. Is talent evenly distributed? What do you mean exactly by that?
I think you can, and in personal experience, I do think you can find talent all around the globe. And
so you mean geographically talent is evenly distributed. Got it.
Very
Okay.
geographic. You can go, I really think you can find talent anywhere around the world, but you can't necessarily find access to resources all around the world.
Got it. Okay. So in the current work that you're doing and at this stage in advising entrepreneurs and working with them, what's like the one of the more recent moments, the kind of aha moment that you had, or a specific inspiration that you had where you looked or you maybe saw a problem or a trend and you said, I really need to work on this for people. This is the problem I want to solve. What problem did you see needed solving, and what are you doing to solve it?
So other than, I guess I would say, kind of trying to get access, democratize access to funding, which is something I'm really passionate about and think should be designed. I think also the process of how we evaluate entrepreneurs could really be redesigned. Are we actually talking to potential customers? Like, who are we thinking and including in the due diligence process when we're evaluating their ideas and whether they deserve funding and at what level? I think the other thing that I've become really passionate about, and it kind of is what I do now, is a lot of times there's always the idea person, and that person is normally the person put up in lights, and it's the founder. And then there's like the venture capitalists, and it's the funders on the other side. And where I found that I fit in, and what I absolutely love to do, is to help the idea person bring that concept to fruition through helping them sort out all of the pieces of the strategy and execution. So, for example, actually, do you have an idea, Cody, that you want to launch? If not, I can give another example.
Do you want me to just give you a hypothetical idea?
Sure, go for it.
Okay, cool. All right. A video platform, a video streaming platform that hosts all the content like YouTube, but you can actually contribute directly just like on Patreon. And it has 4K video.
Amazing. Okay. Tell me, what is the problem you're solving? Like, why is that your idea? What's the problem you feel like is missing in the market?
Problem missing in the market is creators on YouTube are subject to YouTube's algorithm, and their ad revenue is a very low proportion of what they would normally receive. And therefore, it's an inconsistent revenue stream because they don't know if they're going to get $200 or $3,000 from ad revenue in a month. Whereas if listeners and viewers are funding directly, it's a more steady stream, more stable stream of income.
Okay, so who do you think are your the target customers that would actually be really interested in being on this type of platform?
Creators who don't necessarily release videos that are YouTube algorithm friendly. Maybe they're not able to release on a consistent schedule. Sometimes their production timelines shift, or their content just isn't very clickbaity.
Okay, interesting. And do you already have ideas on how you might be able to find some of those customers, or those people who are going to be putting the creators rather?
Advertising in the right places and reaching out directly. There are tools that will allow you to estimate how much money channels are making from YouTube. So using that tool to identify creators with low-ish subscriber bases, but high quality content that would lend itself to a passionate, engaged audience who would then directly contribute on the other platform versus relying on the ad revenue.
Okay, fantastic. So if we were going to start to try and prototype or test this idea to see if there's interest, I think we'd first take what you just said and this is your idea on how you might find these people. We'd get a couple of them to actually do some user interviews with us and sit down and say this is what I care about, this is what I don't care about. I think we'd narrow then in on who that target customer is even more specifically. Is there a certain demographic? Is it actually an even more specific type of video? Because generally when you're building a new concept, you want to start with one target market versus boiling the entire ocean. So let's say we do that. I'm curious, what are some of the elements of this solution that you think we should build first, or you'd want to actually throw in front of your audience that you think would create the most value for them, for these creators?
A very seamless dashboard that allows them to see what money they're making, money in, money out, and the commissions that they're basically paying the website to host. Basically the cut they're getting versus where they would get over other sites. Transparency, essentially. Tools to allow them to understand what they're getting and who their audience is.
Perfect. So then what I would probably suggest to you is let's actually draw it. Let's hand draw the dashboard, pen and paper, and actually put it in front of people. And then from that, we'd figure out, okay, what are actually the most critical things to launch? And only at that point would we actually start engaging any sort of engineering. And even before that, we'd probably build out frameworks or do something in design before we'd actually move to building. And then I'd suggest we launch with a very small test group and then start to see if it picks up traction. And this way, I think I could help you do it if you actually wanted to. Sorry, as I'm starting, I'm oh, and then we could do this and this and this. Another thing I'd want to talk to you about if we were building this concept out is who are the places and the partners to make this a lot easier. So, anytime you're building what you just suggested, it's a two-sided market because you have to get first all of the creators on the platform, and the other side is getting the people to actually listen to the creators. And they're super hard to build, and generally investors don't like them as much because of that fact. But we could start to brainstorm, are there other actually podcasts that would be very interested in talking about this, and they could send it out to their audience? What are some partnerships that you could have that maybe they would be happy to share this concept with their audience, who then might be also willing to get on the platform? We then start brainstorming once we feel we have a better sense of the problem that we're solving and the potential solution, on ways to get people on both sides of the platform.
So what I think I'm hearing is that a lot of times maybe a creator will think, I have a solution. I'm now going to build that solution. But instead of what they should be doing is saying, I have a solution to a problem, a potential solution. Let's take this problem and my potential solution and workshop it. Just a lot of workshopping, basically. Bring it to the people that I think it's actually solving for and make sure it is actually solving for them. And then make sure that the elements of my solution that are being built first are the ones that they really care about the most, and then expand from there.
Yes, you synthesized that very well. And so the role that I take on is that person who helps you go through all those steps and really crystallize not only the problem, but how to get to launching a very successful solution.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I've worked for a few startups before, and recall a couple were built with great products and ideas, but not necessarily, again, solving for something that maybe needed to be solved or was focused in that way. So then what you end up doing, and I'm sure you've probably seen this, is what happens is later on, after you've built a bunch of stuff, you've got to pivot. And sometimes that takes a lot of resources, like more resources than it would have taken if you had built it the kind of right way in the first place.
Yeah, that's actually leads into very much so. At one point in my career, I got a phone call from a co-founder saying, "Hey, we are struggling because we have all this data, but our users aren't using any of the data, and therefore it's like it's not making any sense. We're not selling any more product. What can you come in and completely redesign the product?" And one of my favorite things was they hadn't talked to users after building the product, to exactly what you're saying. It's like there's a point where you realize, like, oh, I can't just stop talking to users. It has to be consistent. But in that role, what I loved was getting to physically like work and build a product with both an engineering team, a design team. Yeah, I'm happy to talk more about like how you design something from how you scale something as well.
Gosh, I mean, well, we've talked a lot about the design, and it sounds like really end to end, right? You've helped early stage startups, and it sounds like you've helped a lot of scale ups too. So I guess that would be the next question. Like, let's say we go to the people is our target. We say, all right, what's the most important thing you want us to solve? They tell us. We build a couple things that solve it. All right, great. We get some users on board, and then it's like, okay, what's next? When designing that product. I guess at what point do you consider it less startup, more scale up? Like there's no line, right? So maybe talk a little bit about that evolution.
I think scaling really, it does come after you found, in general, product market fit. But I would say, to your point, all of these lines are very fuzzy. And a lot of it is like reading the tea leaves and trying to navigate like when is the right time, because also like when scaling, it is really important to have the right team in place, because also oftentimes when I'm sometimes called in to help founders, they've gone from a very tight knit like 10-15 person team, and now suddenly they're at 40 or 50 people, and that initial culture that they had where they could literally just turn to their like the neighbor next door and say like, hey, what are you thinking about this? That's kind of dissolved as you get bigger and bigger. And so when you're scaling your product, you also have to think, if your organization is like scaling in somewhat of a fashion, how am I building out the team and the culture that will consistently support as my growth and whatever I'm building.
Yeah, and sometimes the culture can involve with it, particularly very small teams, right? Like you have that one person that kind of does everything. And
Yes.
if something happens to that person or they decide to leave, like the whole place is just stuck, right? Like that's not an uncommon thing that you've seen.
Yes, not uncommon. And then thinking about like what is the culture you want to build? Like when you're only a couple people, but like once you get to 40 or 50, it's being really, I think, thoughtful about like, do we want a culture of creativity? Do we want a culture of like transparency? Like what is the kind of culture, and how are we finding people that like really match that?
That's interesting because I'm wondering, are there cultures that don't really scale? But what I mean by that is like when you're first launching a startup, sometimes you've got to be maybe really cutthroat or maybe really conservative about certain things in order to be really lean. You always want to be smart about your business, but are there situations where you've got this just like ravenous startup culture? We really just like, pounding home the 60-hour weeks. And then there comes a point where you're like, that's actually not sustainable. We actually need to change the culture. Like sometimes it's maybe good to actually go a different direction, right?
Yeah. I think some of the best founder CEOs that I have met have really worked on learning to evolve as they see their needs of their company to evolve. And it's easy to say that, and it's a lot harder to do. Like even personally, like realizing there's areas of my own personal life that I need to evolve, but actually going through the work. And I think a lot of that is keeping really close tabs on the people in your team, how they were doing, At the same time, though, you're also face pressures of like you need to fundraise, like you need to make sure that you're making payroll. There's so many of these different pressures. And I think this sometimes comes back to when you've built the right support network for yourself, whether it's a couple other sounding boards in your same organization, maybe it's even a sounding board outside that can gather information for you so that you're not having to do everything, can be really helpful to ensure that you're staying on track with how you want to see the arc of your company build out.
Cool. So I know from your bio, you have worked in competitive environments for entrepreneurs. I believe you've funded entrepreneurs in the third most difficult country to raise capital. So what environments are those that are so difficult? And what is the special sauce that allowed you to break through and be so impactful in those difficult markets?
Yeah, so there's many things that make, and the country was actually Venezuela. It is very difficult to fund entrepreneurs in countries where there's political instability, and there's a lot of reasons for that. One reason is because you're always concerned that the regulations are constantly changing. There's not a clear legal structure. Things could immediately shift, and you actually don't know whether your funding is there. A whole entire issue is like, is your funding actually getting to that person? So even when funding entrepreneurs in like countries like that, generally we, like most investors, still need a bank account or money that is held in a country that is considered more secure and stable and has laws and regulations that aren't going to like quickly change, or have the potential to quickly change if there's political unrest. So I think one step is making sure that you have all of the legal and regulations sorted out. I think the other step that is I think like equally as important is a lot of people agree, yes, hey, we should fund entrepreneurs in developing countries. We should fund entrepreneurs like around the world who have great ideas. And then there is the moment where you are presented with an idea and you're like, this feels risky. And I think a lot of people's risk assessment doesn't end up matching what they want to do in theory. So something that has made us more successful in doing that is putting it to the forefront of we actively want to fund the best concepts in places where this feels risky, and outlining like what does risk mean or what does it look like, so that when we get to a point where we have an idea that we're super excited about, but we like our gut are suddenly like, oh, this feels a little risky, we go back to almost like what our bylaws are and ensure we're kind of meeting those risk profiles.
So just having really specific criteria for what defines risk and what elements of that risk is acceptable, basically.
Yes, and I think finding leaders who that is something they care about and value, and it comes through in their own leadership style as well. Like they have, I think one question I tend to ask a lot of leaders are like, what are your top 3 values and how did they get expressed in your leadership style? And so if someone says courage, or integrity, or transparency, that's going to be a very different type of leader than someone who says responsibility. Well, maybe not necessarily responsibility, but like it could be things that kind of are the opposite of like, I don't really care about transparency. I don't really care about like taking those types of risks. I don't really need to be brave in my work. So thinking about that one also when you're working with different funders of like, are they the ones who you feel like will support you as you're taking different types of risks?
Yeah, I've spoken with other guests that have suggested that really VCs aren't investing in startups. They're investing in the person, the founders, right? The founders kind of behind that. Are there any red flag words that they would use that you would advise startup founders to maybe avoid?
I don't know. I don't know if I can say any.
Okay, all right.
I would say if talking to other people they have funded historically is always a really good idea. And I think most people, when they're looking for funding, they try and do that because you are also getting to do your due diligence on these funders as much as they're doing their due diligence on you.
Cool. Are there situations where a startup founder will call up another startup founder and say, hey, you got funded. How do you like working with this VC? And sometimes they're just like, we really hate working with this VC.
Yes. I think people are hopefully more politically correct than that, and politically kind. But I think so. I mean, I've worked at different companies where I can't always say like that I we're at the top of the best in what we do in terms of how we support our entrepreneurs. I think, though, if you are very clear on both sides up front on like what this investor is willing to provide and what they are not, it will help make the entire relationship better.
Yeah, I like really all I can think of is Shark Tank. And I'm sorry to bring it back to such a like kind of pedestrian example, but there are pitches where Mark or where the one guy, I don't remember his name, will say like, I've got every contact in the fashion and clothing and retail industry ever, and you're selling a t-shirt. And then, Mark Cuban or somebody will say, well, I'll give you more money. And he's like, dude, I know everybody that can distribute your product like in the world, basically go with me. So that ends up being a huge thing. And you can see it day to day, even on those pitches. So that is something just, I guess, founders need to consider when they go to VCs as well. It's just kind of the same situation, right?
True. And that's a great question to ask if you're interviewing other or talking to other entrepreneurs who've been funded by that person is like, what kind of connections have they made for you? Did they have someone who was able to step in and help support you if you needed to? But also the VCs, that's not their thesis, and that's totally fine. It just depends. Like, do they have someone more similar to my role on staff where you literally come in and you're like, okay, what is the roadblock right now? How do we actively work as a team to sort through it and get you to the other side? Or they're like, we'd rather give you more money, or we're going to cut you a smaller check, but we're going to help introduce you to other funders who are going to be able to give you more resources.
Very cool. I think his name was Damon, by the way. I think it's Damon. Do you watch that show?
No, I don't.
Okay. Really?
Well, no, I've seen a couple episodes, but I haven't watched it recently. It is fun. It is very fun.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically like what you do, but like cut way down, edited significantly, and made for a broad audience. So kind of like that's why I said it's kind of like the pedestrian example of like you're really doing the work and actually talking and working with these founders, and that's just a TV show. But I do want to, we'll wrap up in a second, but I want to ask, like, if you want to speak directly to our founder, entrepreneur, aspiring entrepreneur listener, what is the biggest piece of advice you think you can give them based on their experience? Maybe something you've seen done right or wrong really often that you're like, yes, do this or don't this, that might help people just kind of weather the storm of entrepreneurialism?
I think it depends at what stage. It's a great question. It depends what stage the entrepreneur is in. If you're really early on, I cannot stress enough, what is the problem you're solving? And if you're like, well, I want to launch a new ice cream, and you're like, there's not a problem there. It's what is the opportunity that you are then presenting to people? So you can frame it either way, but it's really getting super clear on what is the problem and then who are your users. For those later on, I would say do not let perfection get in your way. I have definitely seen founders where they want their first product or their first launch to be completely perfect. Just get something out there, get testing, get it in the market. I know it like feels like, oh, but it's got to be perfect the very first time. And that is true in some cases, like if you're working in nuclear technology, it does need to be perfect the first time. But for a lot of founders, it doesn't. It's just about getting something out in the market and testing it. And knowing that it's going to be hard when you get that first initial feedback, or maybe you don't get all the phone calls that you expect to get, or whatever it might be. So doing a check-in with yourself, like, how do I feel about keeping going? Who is my support network? And what are the next 3 steps I can take? And who can I talk to that actually could help guide me in getting over this roadblock?
Yeah. Sometimes done is better than perfect.
Yes.
Megan, you're an expert on a lot of things. So where can people find you, follow you, learn more about you, maybe work with you? Any links you'd like to share, and I will add them in the show notes?
Yeah, sure. People are welcome to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I do try and respond to as many as I can. And if you have a venture idea, send it my way. I'm happy to take a look and send back feedback if it makes sense.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for joining me on our podcast. It was really fun talking to you, and looking forward to seeing all the cool work you're doing in the future. I know you work a lot in sustainable solutions and just really cool, socially conscious kind of startup ecosystem, which I think is really fantastic. I know we didn't even touch on it in the interview, but really cool to see what you're working on in the future. So thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Cody. Appreciate it.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation. And if your ears perked up when I talked about that hypothetical YouTube alternative, then I encourage you, for no particular reason, to visit Giveo.com, Giveo. No, I didn't build it, but I sure do like it. Anyway, you can find a link to that in the description of today's episode. Next week, I'll be talking to an investor about what to not do in your pitches and how to stand out in a competitive space to get the funding you need. To make sure you don't miss that episode, just follow the Funding Blueprints on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast app. That way you'll get new episodes as they become available for free. In the meantime, let's keep the conversation going. Join StartHub's engaged community of entrepreneurs and investors on Discord. There's a link to find that in the description of today's episode. The Funding Blueprint is produced by me, Cody Goff, with audio and video editing by Sean Patel. No relation to Megan Patel, that's Sean Patel, P-E-T-E-L-L. If you're looking for exceptional sound design or audio-video production work, get in touch with Sean at seanpatel.com. Thanks again for joining me, and have a great week.